Airport staff humiliated and expelled Karoline Leavitt, but everything changed. When her husband showed up, the sun had just begun to rise over San Francisco, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink. Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, adjusted her designer purse and glanced at her phone for the time. She was en route to San Francisco International Airport, heading back to Washington, D.C., after attending a major conservative event. As the spokesperson for the Trump administration, she was no stranger to controversy, frequently defending policies that put her in the crosshairs of the left-leaning media. The previous night, her husband, Nicholas Rio, had reassured her over the phone. "You're in this role because of your talent and resolve. Don't let anyone shake that." She held on to his words as she stepped into the bustling airport terminal, moving with confidence through the throngs of early morning travelers. With her platinum blonde hair perfectly styled and a composed demeanor, she carried herself with the poise of a true MAGA figure. Approaching the first-class check-in counter, Karoline placed her ticket and ID on the counter with a polite, "Good morning." The woman behind the desk, Jennifer Brooks, glanced up with a professional smile. Her name tag gleamed under the terminal lights. Jennifer, a vocal liberal known for her online posts criticizing Trump and conservative policies, instantly recognized Karoline from her many television appearances. "Hello, happy to assist you," Jennifer said smoothly. "You're flying to Washington, D.C., correct?" "That's right," Karoline responded. Jennifer glanced at the ticket, then back up, her tone polite, but edged with something more. "Just to confirm, you're Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary?" Karoline nodded. "Yes, that's me. Is there a problem?" Jennifer smiled faintly, her voice calm yet laced with barely concealed condescension. "Not at all. We just like to ensure everything is by the book, especially for passengers representing the current administration. I hope you understand our caution." Karoline immediately recognized the subtle jab. Though cloaked in professionalism, it was clear Jennifer was taking aim at her political role. Irritation flickered inside her, but she remained composed, unwilling to let a biased airport worker rattle her. Then, Jennifer leaned over to whisper something to a nearby colleague, glancing in Karoline's direction. Perhaps a quiet remark about the MAGA lady. This time, irritation flared into something sharper. A male airport staff member soon approached, holding her documents. His expression was serious yet polite. "Good morning, ma'am. I just need to verify something. You're the spokesperson for the Trump administration, correct?" "Yes, I am," she affirmed. The man, another known liberal who had attended local anti-Trump protests, nodded. His professionalism remained intact, but there was a hint of reluctance in his posture. "Thank you for your cooperation. We just need to make sure everything is in order, especially for high-profile passengers like yourself. Please proceed." Karoline retrieved her ticket and ID, making her way to security. She could feel the stares of nearby passengers, though no one spoke. Nicholas's words echoed in her mind. "Don't let anyone shake that." Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself and continued forward. The TSA checkpoint was crowded but orderly, agents barking instructions as passengers shuffled forward. Karoline placed her purse on the conveyor belt and walked through the metal detector without issue. But as she reached to collect her bag, a TSA agent stepped in front of her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice firm yet polite. "We need to conduct an additional security check." Karoline frowned, glancing at the untouched bag on the belt. "Is there a problem?" "It's just a random check, ma'am," he replied smoothly, though the flicker of suspicion in his eyes told a different story. "Please follow me." With growing frustration, Karoline complied. The so-called random check turned into an unnecessarily thorough pat-down, an exhaustive search of her belongings, and a string of pointed questions. "What's the purpose of your travel, ma'am?" the agent asked, scrutinizing her boarding pass. "I'm returning to—" And then, everything changed when her husband arrived. "Washington, D.C. for work," Karoline answered, her voice clipped but firm. "I'm the White House press secretary." The TSA agent, a known critic of the Trump administration on social media, offered a faint smile, polite, but with a trace of Mockery. An important job. We just need to ensure everything is in order, especially for someone in your position. Heat rushed to Karoline's face at the veiled jab, but she refused to take the bait. She had dealt with enough hostility in the press room. She wouldn't let an airport security officer get under her skin. When he finally handed back her belongings, his tone was curt. "Thank you. You're free to go." Karoline stepped back into the main terminal, rattled but determined. Checking her watch, she realized time was running short before her flight. With renewed urgency, she quickened her pace toward the gate, determined not to let the morning's obstacles distract her. But as she neared her boarding area, she noticed a group of airline staff huddled together, whispering and casting glances in her direction. Her stomach tightened. A middle-aged woman, Laura Mitchell, with a crisp uniform and a name tag, stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, but we need to review your ticket and ID again," Laura said, her voice polite yet firm. Karoline exhaled sharply, her patience wearing thin. Nonetheless, she handed them over, forcing herself to remain composed. Laura examined the documents for an unusually long time before speaking again. "We've received a request for further verification about you. Please follow me. We'll sort this out quickly." Karoline's brows furrowed. "Verification for what?" she asked, irritation creeping into her voice. "It's standard procedure, ma'am," Laura replied smoothly, already turning toward a side corridor. "This way, please." A gut feeling told Karoline something was off, but with little choice she followed, her pulse quickening. The hallway they entered was quiet, away from the bustling terminal. When Laura finally stopped, she turned to Karoline with a carefully measured expression. "I'm very sorry, ma'am, but we can't allow you on this flight due to security concerns. You will need to leave the airport. We apologize for the inconvenience." Karoline stared, stunned. "What? Why?" Laura remained professional, giving a small shrug. "We have our protocols, ma'am." Fury erupted within Karoline. "This is absurd. I've done nothing wrong." Laura folded her arms, her tone unwavering. "If you don't leave voluntarily, we'll have to call security. Please understand." Karoline clenched her fists, her mind spinning. Humiliation burned in her chest, her eyes stinging, but she refused to break in front of them. Gritting her teeth, she reached for her phone and dialed the one person who could help. "Nick," she said, her voice trembling. "I need you." His response was immediate, calm but firm. "I'm on my way." But for Karoline, those words weren't enough to quell the storm raging inside her. Standing in the dimly lit corridor of San Francisco International Airport, she felt utterly stranded. The vibrant chaos of the terminal was just a few steps away, but here, pushed into the shadows, she was isolated. Her flight was departing without her. The reality of the situation pressed down on her like a weight. Laura had already left, returning to the gate as if nothing had happened, leaving. Karoline alone near a door marked "Staff Only." Clutching her bag, her fingers trembled. Instinct told her to move, step back into the public eye where at least she wouldn't be so vulnerable, but doubt kept her rooted in place. Her phone buzzed. A text from Nicholas. "I'll be there soon." "Stay put." Karoline exhaled shakily, his reassurance grounding her slightly. But the indignation remained raw. Why was she targeted? She replayed the morning's events, the TSA agents' probing questions, the airline staff's whispering, the pointed glances. It was all too clear. As the White House press secretary, she was used to facing criticism from the left. But this was something else. This was blatant. Lost in thought, she flinched as the sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor. 2 TSA agents approached, a man and a woman. Their postures were rigid, their expressions unreadable. The man held a clipboard like a shield. The woman carried a handheld scanner. "Ma'am, we need to conduct another check," the man said, his tone neutral but commanding. "Please place your bag on the table." Karoline's jaw tightened. "I've already been checked. Twice." The female agent, who had previously voiced liberal opinions online, kept her expression carefully blank. "This is a random check, ma'am. Compliance is mandatory. We appreciate your cooperation." Karoline stared at them, her stomach twisting. Then, reluctantly, she set her bag down. She watched as they unzipped it and rummaged through her belongings with little regard for order. They pulled out her laptop, flipping it open as if searching for something, anything suspicious. And Karoline knew, without a doubt, that this had nothing to do with security. This was personal. Karoline's toiletry bag was unceremoniously dumped onto the table, its contents scattering across the surface in chaotic disarray. Bottles clattered, a tube of lipstick rolled to the edge, and a small perfume bottle nearly toppled off before she caught it. Her patience frayed. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly despite her effort to remain composed. The male agent ignored her question, instead picking up a stack of documents she had neatly packed. He flipped through, them with an air of suspicion, his expression unreadable. "What's this, ma'am?" "Documents for my work in Washington," Karoline replied, her patience wearing thin. The agent, a known participant in local anti-Trump protests, squinted at the document covers before setting them aside with indifference. The female agent, moving with excruciating deliberation, ran a handheld scanner over Karoline's laptop, as though searching for something sinister. Karoline glanced around, hoping to catch the eye of a passerby, a supervisor, anyone who might intervene. But the corridor remained eerily empty. The isolation made the situation feel suffocating. Minutes passed. The search dragged on, methodical and invasive. Finally, the male agent straightened and spoke, his tone polite but firm. "We need to hold your bag for further inspection." Karoline's heart dropped. "What?" "No," she said, stepping forward instinctively. "You can't take my things. I have a flight to catch." The female agent's gaze hardened, though her voice remained even. "Ma'am, if you don't cooperate, we'll have to escalate this to our superiors. We're just ensuring everyone's safety." Karoline let out a sharp breath, disbelief churning into anger. "Escalate? You've already humiliated me in front of security, and now you're trying to keep my bag without a valid reason? This is harassment." Her voice echoed in the empty corridor, the accusation hanging thick in the air. The two agents exchanged a glance, their expressions impassive. Then the male agent took a step forward, his posture calculatedly neutral. "Ma'am, we ask that you stay calm," he said, his voice carrying a patronizing edge. "We're just doing our job." Karoline's fists clenched. She knew that tone well, the carefully measured condescension, the implication that she was the problem for daring to protest. Before she could respond, another figure appeared at the end of the corridor. Laura Mitchell, the same airline manager who had confronted her earlier. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Two uniformed security guards flanked her, their presence making the already tense space feel even smaller. Laura's voice cut through the charged air. "What's going on here?" The female TSA agent straightened, maintaining her veneer of professionalism. "We're conducting an additional check, ma'am. She's not fully cooperating." Karoline scoffed. "That's not true. I've followed every request you've made, and now you're trying to take my bag without explanation." Laura's sharp gaze studied Karoline for a moment before she spoke again, her tone calm but unyielding. "Ma'am, this situation is becoming disruptive. I'm sorry, but we'll have to ask you to leave the airport." The words hit Karoline like a slap. "You're not serious," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I haven't done anything wrong." Laura's expression remained cold, impassive. "We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who may pose a security risk. Please understand our decision." Karoline's breath caught. "A security risk?" Her voice wavered between disbelief and fury. "You're calling me a security risk? Because I work for the Trump administration?" A heavy silence settled over the corridor. The security guards stepped forward, their stances firm, not aggressive, but unmistakably prepared to act. Karoline felt a tightness in her chest, her breaths coming shallow. This couldn't be happening. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone and dialed. "Nick," she said, her voice unsteady. "I need you. They're kicking me out of the airport." Nicholas Rio's voice came through, steady and commanding. Don't move, I'll handle it. As the call ended, Karoline turned back to Laura and the TSA agents, her spine straightening. My husband is on his way, she announced, her voice carrying the authority of someone well beyond her 27 years. I suggest you think very carefully about what you do next. For the first time, Laura hesitated. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face. But before she could respond, the male TSA agent muttered just loud enough for Karoline to hear, "Husband to the rescue, huh?" Convenient. Karoline's jaw tightened, but she refused to take the bait. Instead, she stepped back, leaning against the cold wall. She could feel their eyes on her, judging, scrutinizing, condemning. Not because she was a threat, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she represented something they despised, and they thought they could break her. They were wrong. She would wait. Beyond the corridor, the world moved on. Announcements blared, passengers rushed to their gates, conversations hummed through the terminal. But for Karoline, time had frozen. Each second stretched unbearably, the weight of humiliation pressing down on her. Then at last she heard it. Footsteps. Steady, deliberate, a rhythm she knew by heart. Relief crashed over her as she looked up to see Nicholas Rio striding toward her. His expression was composed, unreadable, but there was no mistaking the quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. His presence alone commanded attention. The security guards instinctively straightened, their casual authority shifting to rigid alertness. Laura Mitchell, the airline manager who had been at the center of this debacle, glanced up, her forced smile flickering for a moment before she adjusted her stance. Karoline pushed off the wall, stepping toward him. "Karoline," he said, his voice steady as if oblivious to the charged tension around them. "Are you okay?" She nodded, but when she tried to speak, her voice wavered. They're trying to kick me out of the airport." Nicholas's gaze shifted to Laura, cool and expectant. "Is that true?" Laura hesitated, then cleared her throat, forcing her usual professional tone. "Sir, we're concerned about her behavior. She's causing a disruption, and we have procedures in place for situations like this." Nicholas raised an eyebrow, his outward calm unshaken. But there was an edge to his voice now, subtle, but unmistakably sharp. "A disruption?" He let the word hang in the air. "Could you explain exactly how my wife has been disruptive?" Laura opened her mouth, but before she could form a response, the male TSA agent stepped forward, speaking with misplaced confidence. "She hasn't fully complied with our security procedures, sir. We're simply doing our job to ensure safety." Karoline scoffed, her frustration spilling over. "That's not true. I followed every request you made. I let you search my bags, scan my laptop, go through my documents. And when I objected to this obvious harassment, you called it a disruption." A muscle twitched in the agent's jaw, but he said nothing. Nicholas let his gaze sweep over the group, his expression hardening. "It seems there's been a serious misunderstanding," he said, his voice calm but carrying an authority that left no room for argument. "Let's get a few things straight. First, my wife isn't leaving this airport unless she chooses to. Second, I want a detailed explanation of why she was singled out in the first place." Laura cleared her throat again, visibly uncomfortable. "Sir, as I said, we have procedures. Her profile was flagged for attention, and we acted accordingly. Please understand." "Flagged for what?" Nicholas interrupted, his voice now edged with impatience. "She has a valid ticket, full identification, and was cleared for boarding. What exactly warranted this extra scrutiny?" Laura faltered, her confidence wavering for the first time. But before she could answer, the male TSA agent crossed his arms, his tone patient but pointed. "Sir, sometimes we have to make judgment calls, especially when something warrants closer review." Nicholas studied him for a long moment, then spoke, his voice quiet but loaded with meaning. "A closer review. You made a judgment call because my wife is Trump's press secretary, didn't you?" The air in the corridor grew thick with unspoken tension. The female TSA agent shot a nervous glance at her colleague, but he refused to meet her eyes. Laura swallowed. "I assure you, she began, her voice polite but unsteady. "We don't tolerate discrimination at this airport." Nicholas gave a slow, measured nod. "That's an admirable policy," he said, his voice like ice. "But actions speak louder than policies. And from where I'm standing, this entire situation reeks of bias. My wife is standing here humiliated and stressed because your team couldn't handle her political role. Am I wrong?" Silence. A silence so thick, so damning that no one dared to break it. Nicholas let it linger. Let them feel the weight of it. Then finally, he exhaled, the sound laced with quiet disappointment. He turned to Karoline, his expression softening slightly. "Ready to go?" he asked gently. Karoline nodded, clutching her bag tight. Every instinct screamed at her to get as far away from this nightmare as possible. But another part of her bristled at the thought of simply walking away, of letting them off without consequence. They turned to leave, and that's when Laura stammered, "Wait, sir." "Perhaps we can discuss this further to resolve it," Laura offered, her voice carefully measured, but the undercurrent of unease was unmistakable. Nicholas paused, his back still to the group. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, but there was no mistaking the warning beneath it. "You'll be hearing from me again," he said. "I suggest you prepare for a thorough review of your so-called procedures." Without another word, he placed a reassuring hand on Karoline's shoulder, guiding her away. Behind them, the corridor fell into silence, the weight of their departure lingering like an aftershock. As they walked back into the main terminal, the chaotic hum of the airport rushed back in, announcements echoing overhead, hurried footsteps blending into the steady murmur of travel. The contrast was jarring after the stifling stillness of the confrontation. Karoline stole a glance at Nicholas, searching for any sign of the emotions she knew must be simmering beneath his calm exterior. But his face remained composed, his eyes fixed straight ahead. "Nick." She hesitated, then exhaled. "I'm sorry you had to come here. I didn't know what else to do." He stopped then, turning to face her fully. Resting a hand on her shoulder, his gaze softened. "Karoline, you don't need to apologize for standing up for yourself. What happened today was unacceptable, and it's not your fault. You did the right thing calling me." His words settled some of the tension in her chest, but the sting of the morning's events still lingered. "They treated me like I didn't belong here," she admitted quietly, her voice raw. Nicholas's jaw tightened slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled, but the restrained fury was unmistakable. "I know." He exhaled slowly. "And they'll pay for it." They stepped further into the main terminal, the din of the airport swallowing them up. Karoline clutched, her bag tightly, still feeling the imprint of the violation. Every humiliating moment replayed in her mind. The invasive search, the scrutiny, the unspoken accusation that she didn't deserve respect because of her political stance. It was exhausting. She glanced up at Nicholas, his steady presence an anchor in the storm. But she could see it now, the slight shift in his normally even stride, the subtle tension in his shoulders. Beneath his calm, he was furious. They stopped near a row of seats far enough from security to escape prying eyes, yet close enough to keep Nicholas's protective instincts sharp. Karoline sat, her grip tightening on her bag as if it were a lifeline. "Nick," she murmured, her voice low but resolute. "I don't want this to happen to anyone else." Her words hung between them. Nicholas nodded once, firm. "It won't." His voice carried quiet certainty. "We'll make sure of it." At that moment, movement caught Karoline's eye. 3 uniformed airline representatives approached, their body language stiff with discomfort. The woman in front, wearing a name tag that read, Emily Carter, stopped, just a step too far to be casual. Her practiced expression wavered with unease. "Mr. Rio," she began, her voice carefully controlled. "On behalf of the airport and the airline, I'd like to apologize for any inconvenience you and your wife experienced this morning." Nicholas turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Inconvenience?" he repeated, his tone sharp enough to make Emily falter. She hesitated, shifting slightly under his gaze. "I assure you we're taking this matter very seriously. I've been briefed on the situation and wanted you to know we're investigating. Investigating, Nicholas cut in, his voice clipped. Let me be clear, Miss Carter. My wife was humiliated, targeted, and treated like she didn't belong here. That's not an inconvenience, it's bias. If your staff can't tell the difference, you've got a much bigger problem than you realize. Karoline watched the exchange in silence, a flicker of satisfaction piercing through her frustration. Emily's face flushed. She cast a quick glance at her colleagues, as if searching for support. We deeply regret what happened, she said, her tone quieter now. If there's anything we can do to make this right, there is. Nicholas interjected, his voice steady, each word deliberate. First, I want the names of every TSA and staff member involved in this. Second, I expect a full report on the procedures that allowed this to happen. Third, I want assurance that this behavior isn't just addressed, it's eliminated. Emily nodded quickly, fumbling for the notepad in her pocket. Of course, Mr. Rio. I'll personally oversee the investigation. Nicholas's expression didn't shift. You'll do more than oversee, he said smoothly, his voice edged with steel. You'll act. Because if I don't see concrete, immediate changes, he let the pause hang for emphasis. I'll make sure this hits every major national news outlet. The threat, delivered in a measured tone, landed with unmistakable force. The group stood unsettled as Emily Carter scribbled furiously in her notepad, nodding repeatedly while her colleagues hurried off, eager to escape the weight of Nicholas Rio's words. Nicholas turned back to Karoline, resting a firm yet reassuring hand on her shoulder. We're not done yet, he murmured, but first let's get my wife on her flight. The airline's decision to delay the departure stirred murmurs among waiting passengers. Whispers spread like wildfire, heads turning, eyes darting toward Karoline, the woman now at the center of a controversy tied to the Trump administration. Karoline felt their stares. She kept her head down, her grip tightening around her bag as she followed Nicholas to the gate. The agent, a young man with an overly eager smile, swiftly scanned their boarding passes, his hand trembling slightly. Wishing you a smooth and safe trip, Mr. Rio, he said, his voice edged with nerves. Nicholas gave a curt nod, his focus unwavering as they stepped onto the jetway. For the first time that morning, Karoline exhaled, a flicker of relief breaking through the lingering tension. Once settled in their seats, Nicholas turned to her, his expression softening. You okay? Karoline nodded, though her voice betrayed the weight still pressing down on her. I'm just tired. Nicholas placed his hand over hers, his touch steady. I know, but you did the right thing, standing up for yourself, calling me. That took courage. Her eyes welled up, but she quickly blinked the tears away. It shouldn't have to. Nicholas's expression darkened slightly. No, but as long as people judge others for their politics, we have to push back. The flight passed smoothly, but Karoline couldn't shake the heaviness. She gazed out the window, watching the clouds stretch endlessly below, her mind replaying the morning's events on a loop. Laura Mitchell's scrutinizing glare, the TSA agents' invasive questions, the unspoken accusations woven into their every word. Nicholas's voice broke through her thoughts. What are you thinking? She turned to him, her expression resolute. How to stop this from happening again? A faint smile touched Nicholas's lips, pride glinting in his eyes. Because this fight isn't just yours or mine. It's for everyone who's ever been made to feel like they don't belong. His words settled in her chest, igniting something steady and unshakable. By the time their plane touched down at Dulles, Karoline felt a newfound determination. As they disembarked, Nicholas's phone buzzed with an incoming message. He scanned the screen, his jaw tightening briefly. What is it? Karoline asked. Without a word, he handed her the phone, an email from Emily Carter. She read quickly, her eyes landing on the final line. We have placed the involved staff on administrative leave pending investigation. It was a start. As they walked through the bustling Dulles terminal, the weight of the morning still clung to them. The TSA staff's suspension was a small victory, But it didn't erase the humiliation, the scrutiny, the disdain. Karoline stole a glance at Nicholas, who had already pocketed his phone, his mind visibly calculating the next move. "Nick," she hesitated, "do you think anything will really change? They suspended those employees, but isn't that just damage? Control?" Nicholas turned to her, his gaze steady. "You're right to be skeptical. Suspension is a first step, but it's not enough. Accountability has to go deeper. The system that allows this kind of behavior needs to be dismantled." Karoline nodded, though frustration still simmered beneath her skin. "I just don't want this swept under the rug." Nicholas's expression hardened. "It won't be. We'll see to that." As their car wove through the crowded streets of D.C., Nicholas was already making calls. His voice was calm but carried an unmistakable urgency. He recounted the SFO incident, in detail, stressing the need for a strong response. By the time they reached the White House, he had set a plan in motion. The next morning, the story began breaking across media outlets. Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt targeted in SFO scandal. Liberal TSA staff harass White House spokesperson. Calls for accountability over TSA misconduct. Karoline's office released a carefully worded statement laying out the incident and demanding immediate reform. The message was clear. This wasn't an isolated event, and she was determined to use her position to address the systemic issues that allowed political bias to fester. Public reaction was swift and polarized. Supporters flooded social media with messages of solidarity. Critics accused her of exaggerating, of leveraging her role for attention. But amid the noise, one thing was undeniable. The incident had struck a nerve, and within days an internal investigation was underway. An official investigation was launched at SFO, placing both the TSA and the airline under intense scrutiny. As reports surfaced, it became clear that Karoline's ordeal was not an isolated incident. Other passengers began coming forward with eerily similar complaints. Whistleblowers from within the TSA spoke out, painting a damning picture of an agency rife with unchecked authority and unspoken bias. The employees involved in Karoline's case were swiftly suspended pending investigation, but public outrage only grew. One name in particular ignited a firestorm: James Carter. Identified in leaked reports as the TSA agent who had mocked Karoline, Carter quickly became the focal point of backlash. Nicholas followed the unfolding news with a mix of satisfaction and lingering frustration. Media attention was a powerful tool. It kept pressure on those in charge. But he knew public outrage alone wasn't enough. Real change required more than headlines. It demanded systemic reform. In Washington, Nicholas held virtual meetings with TSA and Department of Transportation officials. The mood was tense from the start, with agency leaders initially defending their policies. But Karoline's position within the Trump administration forced them to listen. "This isn't just about my wife," Nicholas began, his voice calm but firm. "It's about everyone who has been made to feel like they don't belong because of their views, their background, or the assumptions of those in power. The SFO incident is a symptom of a much bigger problem, and we have both the power and the responsibility to fix it." He laid out a series of reforms: mandatory bias awareness training for TSA staff, an independent oversight committee to handle complaints, clearer protocols to prevent abuse of authority. Some officials nodded in agreement, while others exchanged weary glances. Resistance was expected. Change was rarely welcomed, especially when it threatened the status quo. By the meeting's end, Nicholas had secured commitments to begin implementing reforms. He knew the road ahead would be long, but this was a start. Meanwhile, the employees who had targeted Karoline faced mounting consequences. Public pressure intensified as more details of their behavior emerged. James Carter, the TSA agent who had taunted Karoline, quickly found himself at the center of controversy. Videos surfaced online, showing past incidents where he had been dismissive, sometimes outright hostile, toward conservative-leaning passengers. An anonymous TSA whistleblower revealed that Carter had repeatedly referred to them as MAGA troublemakers. That revelation, paired with a growing list of formal complaints, sealed his fate. Carter was fired. His complicit colleagues soon followed. Laura Mitchell, the supervisor who had ordered Karoline's removal, was also forced out after an internal review concluded that her actions had been unjustified and inappropriate. The airline framed it as a resignation, but insiders confirmed the truth. She had been pushed out. For Karoline, the outcome was bittersweet. She followed the developments closely, feeling both relief and lingering anger. Seeing those responsible face consequences was satisfying, but she knew their removals were only a small part of a much larger fight. Determined to turn her experience into something meaningful, she began speaking out. In interviews, at public events, and in media op-eds, she shared her story, not just about what had happened to her, but about the deeper issue of political bias and injustice. Her message resonated across the country. Nicholas stood by her, offering guidance and unwavering support, but he also encouraged her to find her own voice. "This is your fight too," he told her one evening, as she prepared for a televised interview. "You have the power to make a real difference, Karoline. Don't be afraid to use it." By the end of the month, the reforms Nicholas had fought for began taking shape. TSA agents nationwide were required to undergo mandatory bias awareness training. A misconduct reporting hotline was established to hold employees accountable. The new Independent Oversight Committee, though still in its early stages, promised to bring greater transparency and enforcement. For Karoline, these changes were a step in the right direction, but she knew the battle was far from over. The SFO experience had been painful, but it had also been a lesson in resilience and the power of speaking out. As morning sunlight cast a golden glow over Washington, Nicholas stood on their balcony, sipping his coffee. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind: media firestorms, high-stakes meetings, policy battles. But as he gazed out over the city, a quiet resolve settled within him. This wasn't his first fight for change, and it wouldn't be his last. Inside, Karoline adjusted her blazer, preparing for another public appearance. She had been invited to speak at a national conference on free speech and accountability, a chance to share her story and the lessons learned. The thought of addressing a packed room made her stomach tighten, but she knew what was at stake. She understood the weight of her voice now. Nicholas stepped into the room, catching her eye in the mirror. "You ready?" Karoline met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. "More than ever." Nicholas appeared in the doorway, his expression soft yet steady. "How do you feel?" he asked gently. Karoline turned to face him, her eyes reflecting a mix of anxiety and determination. "Nervous," she admitted, "but ready." A small smile tugged at Nicholas's lips as he stepped closer. "You've got this," he assured her. "Just speak from the heart. People need to hear your truth." His words were comforting, but the weight of responsibility still pressed heavily on Karoline's shoulders. The SFO incident had ignited a necessary conversation about political bias, yet it was also a stark reminder of how deeply that bias was woven into American society. As White House press secretary, she knew she had the platform to drive change, but the path ahead would not be easy. The conference was held in a grand hall in the heart of Washington, D.C., its towering walls lined with banners emblazoned with words like free speech, fairness, and transparency. As Karoline and Nicholas entered, they were met with applause and a barrage of flashing cameras. The attention was overwhelming, but she drew strength from Nicholas's unwavering presence beside her. The audience was a diverse mix: conservative activists, politicians, journalists, and community leaders. When Karoline stepped onto the stage and approached the podium, the room fell silent. Every eye was fixed on her. She took a deep breath, gripping the lectern to steady herself. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and firm despite the nervous energy humming beneath the surface. "I'm Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, and today I want to share a story, one that, unfortunately, I am not alone in experiencing." She paused, allowing the words to settle before continuing. "A few weeks ago, I flew from San Francisco to Washington, D.C., after attending a conservative event. What should have been a routine work trip turned into something entirely different: an experience of humiliation, bias, and harassment. I was targeted, scrutinized, and ultimately denied boarding. Not because of anything I did, but because of what I represent, the MAGA movement. Her voice grew stronger as she detailed the events of that day, the invasive search, the dismissive attitudes, the blatant assumptions made about her political stance. She spoke of the frustration, the humiliation, and ultimately, the resolve that carried her through. "This isn't just about me," she said, her gaze sweeping the audience. "It's about every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong because of their beliefs. It's about a system that allows political bias to dictate how people are treated, and it's about the change we must demand, together." As she finished, the room erupted into applause. The energy was electric. People stood, clapping, nodding, some even wiping away tears. As Karoline stepped off the stage, Nicholas was there, waiting. His eyes shone with pride as he pulled her into a brief embrace. "You were incredible," he whispered. "That's exactly what people needed to hear." Karoline exhaled, a wave of relief washing over her. But more than that, she felt something deeper, a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for fairness, for free speech, for accountability. It wasn't over, and she was ready to keep going. A movement begins. In the weeks that followed, the reforms Nicholas had championed began to take hold. Mandatory bias awareness. Training was rolled out for TSA staff nationwide, aimed at challenging political prejudices and fostering professionalism. An independent oversight committee was established to investigate complaints and ensure accountability. A bias reporting hotline was launched, giving passengers a direct channel to report discrimination. The changes sparked intense debate. Many conservative supporters saw them as a long overdue step forward, while critics dismissed them as politically motivated. Nicholas was no stranger to pushback, but he remained steadfast. Progress was never easy, but that didn't make it less necessary. Karoline, too, continued fighting for change. She used her platform to elevate the voices of others who had faced similar injustices, sharing their stories in speeches, interviews, and social media. Her words didn't just spark conversations, they inspired action. One afternoon, Karoline received an email from a supporter who had recently traveled through SFO. "I don't know what changed," the email read, "but I want to thank you. Your story made a difference. This time I was treated with fairness and respect, something I hadn't experienced in years." Karoline read the message twice, her heart swelling with gratitude. She forwarded it to Nicholas, who responded with just 4 words. "This is why we fight." A lasting impact. As months passed, the ripple effects of the SFO incident continued to spread. Other airports began adopting similar reforms. Conservative advocacy groups pushed for broader changes in the transportation sector. The national conversation about political bias expanded beyond just TSA screenings. It reached media organizations, local governments, and public policy discussions, shining a light on the deep polarization within American society. For Karoline, the experience was transformative. She had stepped into a firestorm and emerged stronger, more resolute than ever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the Washington skyline, she stood on the balcony of their apartment, staring out over the city. Nicholas joined her, handing her a glass of wine. "You realize this is just the beginning, right?" he said with a smirk. Karoline chuckled softly, clinking her glass against his. "Good. I'm not done yet." Bold voices shaping our future ChatGPT said the experience had been painful and humiliating, but it had also been a powerful lesson in resilience, the importance of standing firm and speaking out. As White House press secretary, Karoline had found her voice and learned how to wield it, not just for herself, but for countless MAGA supporters who had faced similar injustices. One evening, as she and Nicholas sat on their balcony overlooking the twinkling city lights, she turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think things will really change?" she asked. Nicholas took a slow sip of his coffee, his gaze steady. "Change comes slowly," he said. "But every step matters. Every voice raised, every injustice challenged. It all adds up." The fact that you're asking this, that you care enough to fight for a better future, means we're on the right path. Karoline nodded, her resolve hardening. The road ahead would be long, filled with obstacles, but she was ready to walk it, a symbol of the fight for free speech and accountability. Karoline Leavitt's ordeal at San Francisco International Airport, SFO, became more than just a personal struggle. It became a defining moment in the ongoing battle for free speech and accountability in an increasingly polarized America. Her story underscored the power of resilience, the necessity of holding biased institutions accountable, and the potential for real change when individuals refuse to be silenced. For Karoline, this was just the beginning. Once a rising political figure, she had now emerged as a formidable voice for conservatives nationwide. The clash at SFO, between a conservative public figure and liberal-leaning airport staff, was a microcosm of the broader ideological battles shaping the nation in 2025, where tensions between left and right had only grown more pronounced. At the heart of the controversy were SFO employees like Jennifer Brooks and James Carter, who had targeted Karoline not for her actions, but for her political identity. Jennifer's special passenger jab and James's MAGA troublemakers remark were more than just offhand comments. They were proof of how personal bias could seep into public institutions, turning routine interactions into ideological battlegrounds. But what happened next demonstrated that injustice does not have to go unanswered. The arrival of Nicholas Rio, Karoline's husband and a real estate businessman with strong ties to the Trump administration, added pressure to the situation. The involvement of the White House forced real consequences. James Carter was fired, and Laura Mitchell, the manager responsible for Karoline's expulsion, was also removed from her position. The incident proved a critical point. In modern America, combating bias and discrimination often requires not just conviction, but influence, strategy, and strong networks of support. Turning humiliation into strength. Karoline's response to the ordeal served as a blueprint for conservatives facing political bias in their daily lives. Instead of reacting emotionally in the moment, she remained composed, stood her ground with her valid ticket, and called upon trusted allies like Nicholas to escalate the matter strategically. Then, rather than allowing the experience to be just another headline, she used her platform to speak out, delivering a powerful speech at a free speech and accountability conference, sparking a nationwide conversation about bias within federal agencies. The pressure she and Nicholas applied led to meaningful policy changes within the TSA. Mandatory bias awareness training for TSA agents nationwide, ensuring professionalism regardless of passengers' political views.